Hello, thank you for joining me today. Well, today it is Monday. It's October the 5th. I hope you had a great Saturday and Sunday, and we hope we can be a part of you having a great Monday and a great week here. Well, we're going to quickly get into things because today is going to be more lengthy than normal. As I've said last week, I have been working on condensing my devotions down and getting them down to about 5 minutes, just putting more into a short amount of time, and I've done that. But today is going to be longer than normal. It is probably going to end up being about 15 minutes. And so I'm going to jump into this pretty quickly. This is really kind of the setting of the theme for the next 4 weeks. And by the next 4 weeks, I mean the time up until Election Day. And I'm doing this on purpose. But we are going to have four separate themes in the 4 weeks that we have. But today's going to kind of set the theme for those four themes that we'll have, okay? So this is about me giving you a little bit of my perspective that started as a boy and how it affects me to this day. And if you'll listen, it's a lot of stories. And some of you will appreciate this because if you're local, and I say local by where I grew up, then you'll understand the names and the places and all of that. But I'm going to get started because it is lengthy. And if you'll bear with me, I'll give you a Bible verse, maybe 3/4 or closer to the end, and you'll understand where we're coming from. In 1975, 1976, that was my fifth grade year. I attended Trindale Elementary School in Archdale, North Carolina. I loved that little school and loved the teachers. My principal actually ended up being one of the, I think, North Carolina representatives, maybe state senators, but he was in the North Carolina government system, Mr. Jerry Tillman. He was our principal. Everybody respected him highly. I know he always showed up in his suit coat and tie, and he walked around whenever he was around. Man, everybody just got quiet, a little bit like we were in awe of him. But he was my principal, and that was the year that it was the celebration of 200 years of our country's founding. When I say founding, 1776 to 1976, 200 years. And I remember all the emphasis that went into it. I remember plays that we did. I remember I'm sure the special teaching. I remember a mural that we worked on. It was a chalk mural at the back of the classroom, and we were, there were figures. There was these figures like George Washington and these different war scenes, and the old cannons. I just remember we did that, and I learned a lot about our country in the fifth grade. And then that next school year, the sixth grade. You've heard me say this. I got saved as a boy on November 14th, 1976. That's the day after my birthday, November 13th, 1964. So I turned 12 years of age. All that to say, in the sixth grade, that would have been the 1976, 1977 year, then I remember it was an election year for the president. Now they made this a big deal because we had no really interest in it as at that age group, but they told us about the candidates. There was President Ford at the time, and then there was Jimmy Carter, who was the Democratic side, and they said, we want you to choose a side. And I didn't even have any idea of how to choose, didn't even know what was going on. I knew that President Ford was the president. I'd heard of Jimmy Carter and different things people would say, but choosing somebody, I think I chose Ford, but honestly, it didn't have anything to do with me being conservative or man, this is the right way to go. I don't know why. Maybe his name was just more familiar. But all that to say, we learned some things, and we kind of did these mock debates. We just had these debates, and our debates were definitely more civil. But at any rate, we did these things. I'm saying I was learning a few things there. Now we're going to jump forward again. Eighth grade, I was at Archdale Trinity Middle School. And we were the first class in seventh grade to attend the brand new building, and we had just come from the Trinity Junior High, and I'm just saying that because there's people where I grew up, they'll understand that. We were the last class in the old building that was the old Trinity Senior High building, and even had where it was located was the original Duke University, or what became Duke University as it moved to Durham. All that to say, I was in the eighth grade. We had a teacher from Trinity Senior High come to the middle school, and I think two or three other students. And I didn't know what this was about. It was not our normal class. They asked us to meet in a special meeting with them. I didn't know what it was about, but they gave us some information about what was the speech team. And they said, you've been selected to consider being on our speech team. And it's voluntary, but we're asking you to consider it, and we're going to tell you a little bit about it. And so they did. So Mr. Randy Shaver, I think, was the teacher. He was the speech coach. And he said, we've got a good program. We've got a good reputation. It would be worth your while to do it. You learn a lot, da, 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 da. Look, I was just a country boy redneck. I wasn't interested in speeches, but I said, you know what? For some reason, they've asked me to do it. I don't know why, but I'm gonna go ahead and give it a try. So ninth grade. This would have been the 1979-1980 school year. I was 15 years old, and I went to the senior high school there in Trinity as a freshman. And then I remember we met, and the speech coach says, "Now we're going to go over to the cafeteria. And we're going to find out what you're best suited for on our speech team." Now I know I can't remember all the different categories, but I do remember this. They had the debate section, and I chose not to do the debate section. It sounded too complicated for me. And then they had what was called original oratory. Again, if you've ever been on the speech team, you know what I'm talking about. They had some dramatic things where you'd actually take some portion of a book or a play and you'd kind of act it out and be two or three characters. I didn't want anything to do with that. Then they had this thing, and then they said this is really the shorter of the speeches you would make, but you do have to put a lot of work into it. It was called extemporaneous speaking. Well, I picked that. And I probably picked it because it had something to do with being short. And I kind of thought, well, let me do that because I don't want the original oratory was supposed to be a little bit longer. Anyway, it was competition, and you went to other high schools and you competed. And so we started practicing and we started doing all this stuff. Now, what does that have to do with what we're talking about now? Well, here's what was involved with extemporaneous speaking. Again, I may not have all the details correct here, but I do remember it was about basically speeches about current events. And a lot of it did have to do with government and that sort of thing. Now, bear in mind, I'm 15 years old, and yeah, I know a little bit, but I wasn't into government. I didn't sit around and watch the news for all the different sides. I just didn't do that. That was no interest to me. But I did have a slight interest, of course, because I would consider myself patriotic at the time, based on what a 15-year-old would even know. But all that to say, they said part of what you've got to do in making your speeches is you have to read current events. You have to be very well versed, because when you go into competition, they literally take these little pieces of paper and you have to argue a position, and you reach into basically what we'll call a hat or a box, and it has you reach out and you pick out 3 pieces of paper about the size, honestly, of a fortune cookie piece of paper, maybe a little bit longer. And you reach in there and you don't know what you're getting, and you've got to pick one of the 3 topics that you get. That could be anything. That's why you have to know a little bit about what you're going to talk about before you even get it, because you have about 30 minutes to prepare this, and then you go into a room and you make a speech, and there's a judge sitting there, and they judge you, and based on how you do and how accurate you are more than anything, and how well you, I guess, argue your point, then that's how you rank. So I was a little bit afraid to do this, to be honest with you, because I didn't like standing up in front of people, shy, and I just didn't aspire to that. But I said, I'm going to do it anyway. So we had to read magazines like Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report. You had to have a little bit of an idea of things going on in the current events by newspapers. So I kind of learned a lot about things going on at the time. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Okay, at the time, in 1979 and 1980, you've got to realize that was another presidential year. And that was the year that we had to decide, I say we because I couldn't vote then, between President Jimmy Carter and candidate Ronald Reagan. And at that time, of course, I had an idea between a Democrat, that was President Carter, and Ronald Reagan was the Republican side of it. Now, let me give you some things I've got written down here. I remember these by memory, but I had to look up and make sure I've got the details right. Here's some things that affected me based on how I started molding my opinion towards who I would be in the political spectrum, okay? All right, notice this. In 1979, it was November the 4th, 1979, and I remember this. November the 4th, 1979, it was the beginning of what was called the Iran hostage crisis. It ended up being 444 days in length. And I remember as a kid when I would sit around, and if someone was watching the evening news, especially the what was called the national news, we watched news from 6 to 6:30, which was our local news. We normally watched Channel 8. Fred Blackman, if you remember them, and Frank Deal was our weather guy. At 6:30, then the national news came on, and that's where you would watch someone like a Walter Cronkite or whoever it was at the time. Anyway, they started clicking off the days. And I noticed the days went from, you'd see the 20s, the 30s, it got to 100. And then I remember getting way up there and all this discussion about we've got our people, the hostages there in Iran. The U.S. Embassy was overtaken. I remember hearing them talk about the weakness of the present government and the president, and then how we need to be strong. And I started molding some opinions about, okay, I wonder what that's all about. And then I started hearing, of course, when Ronald Reagan started giving his side and his position. And I remember hearing all of this, and I remember seeing what seemingly was a less patriotic emphasis, and definitely people who seemed to be a little bit more, I don't know, I'll just use the term less patriotic. It just didn't seem, the enthusiasm wasn't there like it was in 1976. I'll say that. Now, bear in mind, from a 12-year-old until a 15-year-old, I suppose there can be some big changes in thoughts. But again, these things were just starting to build on me. Another thing, it was also the year of the Olympics. And I remember people saying, boy, we need to really get the fervor back in our country. I also remember when I was doing these speeches, now here's where I want to get back to that. All these things that I was researching, I noticed there was a lot of things about how the military was being depleted. I remember reading articles about, are we stronger than Russia or not in the military sense? I remember all these things. I remember thinking, man, who in the world could be stronger than America? Because I knew enough about our country that we definitely were, I thought we were number one no matter what. When the Olympics came on, obviously when we got the gold or we won, it was like, yeah, that's the way it's supposed to be. But I remember there seemed to be people that was just either putting down America or the expectations were low. I remember that in the military regard. I remember that in terms of that Iran hostage situation. And then I remember hearing about the excitement of February 22nd, 1980. It's called the Miracle on Ice. The United States hockey team, which basically was made up of amateurs, ended up winning the gold. And the reigning gold medal champions was the Soviet Union. We defeated them. I think we ended up defeating Sweden. Anyway, we won the gold. I remember them thinking that was almost like unheard of. And for some reason, it started really building this great momentum of patriotic fervor. And I remember that was kind of being headed up with President, or, who would become president, President Reagan, who was obviously at that point not the president yet. I didn't get to vote. I was too young to vote. But I remember thinking about that. And so I'm saying all that because I started building a mindset of where I was as an American. And I remember hearing once President Reagan got in, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. I noticed that there was a lot of disdain. And I noticed there started to be this great divide between the parties. And I noticed there was this divide between what is American and how strong should we be and all these different things. And the word conservative started being brought up. Now let's jump forward to our present time. Now, a lot of things, of course, happened between 1980 and here we are, 2020. I'll give you that. That's 40 years. But all that to say, here we are. And I can remember people thinking about at that point of time in 1980. Bear in mind, 444 days had passed, and then the hostages were released. They actually were released literally minutes after President Reagan was inaugurated. He took the oath of office, and people said, yeah, that's because they knew what President Reagan would have done. And it's good that they did that because there's no way that this thing was going to continue that long. And I did think, man, how in the world could they hold Americans for that long? Now, we could look at the right, the wrongs, who was weak, who was not. But I just remember the momentum building. And then, of course, as I started getting older, I started following a little bit more. Now, here we are. Now, what does that have to do with our present state? Well, there's a lot of division in our country. The idea of voting. I'm going to say it, and I'll say it every video now. You need to vote. You need to let your voice be known. Either way, whether you vote or not, you're deciding on an America that's either worse or better by your vote or your non-vote. That's just a fact. Here we are. We've got 4 weeks. Our country is in a situation in which I believe there's definitely people have made definite statements about what this country is going to be. And one way or another, how this very election, the presidential election, turns out. I'm not going to go all the details. I think most people know where I stand. But I will say this. We're living in a time, okay? We're living in a time in which we need to be understanding what's going on. Let me read the Bible verse here. We're at 14 minutes, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to be done in the next 3 or 4. And so I said 15 minutes. If you'll bear with me, give me 3 or 4 more minutes. As I'm looking here at 1 Chronicles chapter 12, the verse I want to show you is verse number 32. This is basically, is talking about all the people that's kind of standing with who's going to be the new king of Israel, David, okay? And it's talking about these different people who were expert in war. It's talking about people that could do this or that, given all the numbers. But it said in verse number 32, and of the children of Issachar, that was one of the tribes of Israel, which were men that had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do. The heads of them were 200, and all their brethren were at their commandment. Interesting here because it gives thousands in terms of soldiers. And it says here that the children of Issachar, which were men that had understanding of the times. And notice that. To know what Israel ought to do, there were 200 of them. Now that's interesting. I think God has people who have an understanding of the times. I would like to say that if I'm not, I'm certainly volunteering and saying, Lord, I want to have an understanding of the times. But I can say this. We as Christians, because what did all of that I just gave you that little history have to do with the spiritual things? Well, all of that was going on while I attended church. Of course, I'd gotten saved. I'm sure things were mentioned. I don't remember preachers specifically really mentioning the politics of things, but obviously I come from a strong Bible background, and we were people that went out and we knocked doors to win the lost, and we had some fantastic years in church in which people were getting saved. The church was growing. That's my background. And I'm saying that because I believe that the strong Bible background, the strong spiritual background, I'm not talking about religious, not talking about just simply being church-going people or good moral people. I'm talking about people that had a strong connection to the Word of God, the spiritual things, born-again people, spiritual, and that were really trying to make a difference in the people around us and in our country. So all that to say, is there this strong connection between patriotism and spirituality? I think there is. I think there should be. I think it affects, I think one affects the other, but I think the spiritual affects the patriotism. I think one of the reasons why I'm very concerned about my country and why I'm very concerned about what's going on is because I'm not just being a conservative. I'm not just someone that's simply, being aware because I've got some history and I've been educated, but simply because I believe God, and God definitely transforms nations one way or the other. And America's in a transformation stage if she's ever been. And it's really, one of the things I want to do is help us to have a mindset that's ready for November the 3rd, not just simply to vote, but the things that could happen, the things that are going to happen, and where we stand, the way people are viewing the president and the one who's running for office, the different sides, the great divide. The divides that definitely, in my opinion, show not only moral, but the idea of the good and the right and the spiritual versus evil and wrong, and definitely what would hurt our country. So I'm telling you this, and I've gone into extra lengths of time today to say, I'm going to ask you to listen, if you will. I'm going to God and saying, God, give me these things to be a help to the people, and help me, Lord, to be one who has an understanding of the times. After all, look, I'm 55 years old now. I've got a history. You've heard me say some things about my connection, and I want to be a leader in terms of I can help lead people to be right, to do right, then that's what I want to do. If it's just my one voice to a small amount of people, then so be it. But all that to say, I want to be someone who at least understands what's going on. And Christian, you need to understand what's going on out there and really not just be disconnected or say, well, I'm not interested. You need to be interested. And realize there's other 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds just like I was who's watching these things. And some are becoming interested. And definitely I was becoming interested. Going back to that speech team. Now, I went through that process. We had a great year that year. We ended up going to in Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina. We were there on campus. That's where they held the state championship for the speech teams across the whole state. And we were a 2A school, meaning we were not 4A, 3A, but we were 2A. We were smaller, not definitely the biggest school, but we had a great speech team that year. I remember we went there. I was a freshman. There wasn't a lot of expectations on my part, but I remember how excited my speech my speech coach was when he came out and said, "You've made the semifinals." Well, I'd never made a semifinals. I didn't even know what that was. I remember him straightening my tie and straightening my clothes. He says, "You're in the semifinals. This is a big deal." And I remember going into that, and ended up, we won the state championship that year. Trinity Senior High School, I guess it was 1980. Could have been 81, whatever the year was. I think it was 1980. We won the state championship for the speech team that year, and I was excited. I was a part of that. But all that to say, here I am making these speeches, not realizing that one day I'm going to be a preacher who will stand up, and I'll use the term making speeches, sermons, and really kind of talking about topics that I was talking about then in some degree. I know we've gone lengthy. I'm at 20 minutes. I appreciate you listening. It is the longest video I've ever done in our series, but I am serious about this. I'm going to ask you to watch our videos if you will. Share these if you will. And let's make a difference in our country. We are the people. These are the times, and we're the people for these times. Let us be a people that have an understanding of the times, okay? So if you have a great Monday, have a wonderful day.